It's day one of a brand new metagame that looks suspiciously like the old one. But luckily for us, we hadn't figured out everything about the old metagame, and there are a ton of interesting decks popping up because everything has been moving at light speed. We're going to start with this Dormusmu list from Derek. Now, if you're anything like me, you might have noticed a bit of an uptick in Destroy, and in Discard, and in a wide variety of slightly off-meta things recently. This is in part because experimental metagames, which we've definitely been in since the release of Scorpion Brand New Day, Sinister 6, the patch that changed Mother Ascani, there's been a lot of different deck building incentives, but largely the result has been, whether you want to credit the Mother Ascani change or Marvel Snap releasing two fairly compelling build-around cards in back-to-back weeks, that the metagame has been a lot more experimental and a lot more low power as a result of that. There hasn't been a clear-cut, play this for a safe climb because there's been so much weirdness shifting around, which is very different from how the last few weeks before that, and then maybe even the last few months, if you go as far back as Sholau and Star-Lord. Really, you can think about this year as being defined by Sholau, Star-Lord, and Mother Ascani. And now there isn't a card that is defining this metagame in the same way as it was being defined by those cards previously, which leaves a lot of decks a lot more playable than you might expect, because typically when there is one easy villain, or two easy villains, or three easy villains even, you can build a deck like Phantom X and have the tech cards to beat those three easy villains and call it a day. But that's not the world we live in right now. The world we live in right now is maybe it's Batroc at the top, maybe it's a Gambit deck at the top, maybe it's really anything that can do points efficiently and play a couple of decent cards alongside it. And that's kind of what this deck is doing. This deck is saying, actually, if you're playing a Batroc deck, my points are going to be more efficient than yours. I know you have a Hydra Stomper, but I have a Killmonger for your Batroc. I have really good and efficient point output. The Hood is making a 1/6, and then I am getting rid of the Hood. I have a very cheap Death. I have a very cheap Muse. I have a Juggernaut too, and I have a Dormammu that is coming off of a Bucky Barnes, that is coming off of an Uncle Ben. Really, the lesson here is that when the best deck is something like a Batroc, where this is good stats, things that are slightly taller than that can really start to shine. And I think this is a good example of assessing the current metagame situation, where a lot of the best decks are just like, here's my thing that allows me to do something that's like an unfair amount of stats, but it's not too unfair. It's just unfair to other mid-range decks, just the biggest mid-rangey decks in the game, and saying, well, what if I went a little bit further? And I was saying that I'm going to be a better Juggernaut deck than you, because my Juggernaut comes with a bunch of way more efficient points, and how do you ever deal with what I'm doing if I'm doing that to you? And I think that's a really good question to ask. So this is a super compelling Destroy deck to me that I think represents something about what the archetype could be in the future. A little more mid-rangey, a little more Juggernauty, a little bit less Null and Zola. You're going to win by less, but you'll probably win more. I have not perfected this list. I got it from Gamer. I've been swapping cards in and out right now, but one of the consequences of the Mother Ascani nerf is that there's generally just a little bit less Gambit in the metagame. And what I mean by that is there's kind of a lot less Gambit in the metagame. And the Zombie Shell is something that was getting hurt not just by Gambit, but by the other Mother Ascani deck that was running around, the Captain Carter combo deck, because the Zombie Shell against Captain Carter just did less points and didn't have any interaction. Now, though, its biggest predators are on the downswing. That's not to say nobody is playing Gambit and nobody is playing Carter, but a lot less people are now than they previously were. And that is really good for a deck like this, because now zombies can actually try to compete for being one of the best 12-card engine decks in the game. I don't know if it will get there, but it can actually try to compete in a way that simply wasn't true in metagames with Sholau running around, in metagames with Star-Lord running around, and in metagames with Captain Carter combo running around. Those things are not nearly as common anymore. Those things were arguably worse for this deck's existence than the Gambit stuff, and I know that's going to sound crazy to people because Gambit Horseman of Death is not guaranteed to blow up the Horde, but most of the time he will anyway. That's really bad for a deck like this, and that is absolutely true. But I really do think that the fundamental thing pushing this deck out of the metagame was that even outside of that, it wasn't the best vertical deck. And right now, this deck is making enough points that it absolutely can go power for power with tons of stuff. Feel free to customize here. Maybe you want to get a Venusid here. Maybe you want to get an Absorbing Man in here. One of the things that I've found difficult to balance is early game and late game in a deck like this, but it's definitely a deck that has some real power. From Ika, a Pixie Clog list that he's been succeeding very well with in the top 100. It's a really interesting way to try to approach a metagame like this, because typically when metagames are particularly figured out, it's not as profitable to be a Clog deck because Clog is sort of a generic answer to combo decks, right? Like if you don't know what combo your opponent is going to do, but you know it's some kind of combo, Clog is pretty good against most of that, as long as that combo isn't based on things like Carnage and Tombstone. So you don't really want to run into Nimrod here, but a lot of the other combo decks are going to be a little bit weak to this. And that's a particularly compelling way to approach a metagame where we really don't know what our opponent is doing a lot of the time. We are not sure what's going to go on there. And so we want some answers that are going to be able to deal with a bunch of different stuff. And if you think of Clog in the context of being a relatively generic answer that as metagames get more mature becomes less and less viable because it is sort of a little bit inconsistent, and because it's once you know what you're actually trying to beat, it becomes better to actually try and beat that stuff. I think this deck starts to make a lot more sense, which is to say, I'm not sure it has a very long shelf life, but it is exciting that you can do well with something like this. Speaking of combo decks that key off of Destroy, Duplessis has revived an old Jet special, the Zombie Phoenix Force deck. I am a big fan of this kind of archetype in a world where we do not have a concrete ceiling set. There are some real weaknesses here, and by real weaknesses, I really just mean Stardust and Shadow King. Those are the things you're going to want to pay attention to. But also, this is a pretty difficult deck to play until you get the intricacies of it down. The basic thing you're trying to do is get a Firehair down, play a Luna Snow, use the Luna Snow to ramp it to a Zombie Giant Man, and then use your revivals of Zombie Giant Man to make 1 billion points. This also works with Sage, and you can try other things like Cassandra Nova in here. The real point is what you want is a card that adds power to itself as part of its on reveal that you can play, kill off, repeat the on reveal a bunch, and then revive. So for example, what you could be looking at is something like a Zombie Giant Man into a Misery into a Phoenix Force or Adamantium Infusion. That's definitely a powerful line, but there's more. You can do that with a Firehair on the board. You could Kid Omega it and then go Phoenix Force into maybe blowing up the Phoenix Force and then reviving it with an Adamantium Infusion. Lots of things that you could try to do, but a lot of it keys on getting that Luna Snow down on 3 to access your most powerful pieces of output. That said, you can also try it with a superior Spider-Man in here to get more consistent turn 3 ramp. Very valid approach. It's a solid list that is very difficult to understand what's going on when you're playing against it, and I think that plays in its favor. It's also one of the lists that can do the absolute most point output if you're good at understanding what you're trying to do. One cool thing that you can do is when you are reviving something with a Phoenix Force, it becomes that card. So if, for example, you Kid Omega a Zombie Giant Man on the previous turn, then play a Phoenix Force on the next turn and kill it off in the same way. Not necessarily a guaranteed thing you can do, but if you can somehow accomplish this, what you can do is revive it on the same turn with an elixir because it had died the previous turn. The Zombie Giant Man, that is. That's a very interesting thing to note. It works with Adamantium Infusion as well, but not necessarily as easy to make that happen. Another Derek list, Dolau, aka Derek Sholau, I'm not good with names, is a list that I've seen running around recently where the basic premise is everyone forgot how good Werewolf by Night is, and Sholau is still a very powerful card, but it becomes much more powerful when what you're slapping the buff onto is Iska. The rest of what's going on here is just straightforwardly powerful things. Cassandra Nova is a tech card. You can kind of play whatever you want in that spot. Derek was seeing a lot of Arishem, so he's playing Cassandra Nova. I think that's a consequence of people doing things in the Sinister Six space recently. A lot of Arishem Sinister Six, a lot of Thanos Sinister Six, so don't consider that a locked-in thing to do. But the basic premise here is we've got a bunch of generally powerful endgame where our goal is to spend the rest of the deck sort of accessing that, right? Our endgame is insane. Iska, Juggernaut, Werewolf by Night with a bunch of on reveals. Kraglin's just like a 3/9 most of the time. That's great. The rest of the deck is enabling that stuff. We have Merlin, we have Yellow Jacket, we have the Hood, we have a whole Merlin package in here functionally. And the goal there is to just make sure that we're actually getting to good output on that Sholau, mixing things into our curve, Prowler after something moves so we can make sure we're playing 2 skills a turn that cost 0 so we can actually output something like an Iska if we need to. That's the premise here, and I think this is a great example of how relatively lower the map power of this deck, or the metagame as a whole, is, because we would not be able to play this if people were still playing Captain Carter. It wouldn't even be close. We couldn't play this in the Captain Carter metagame. We wouldn't be anywhere near the amount of points we would need in order to beat that deck, but now we can, and it's okay. From Danish, an upgraded version of his combo Sinister Six list. The goal here is to just make sure you're doing something stupid with a Sinister Six, and it's a very reasonable Hela-ish attempt. In other words, this is a deck that I would absolutely expect someone to make around Sinister Six if they were a Hela main, which Danish definitely is. This is the Hela equivalent, the Sinister Six equivalent of Hela. The goal here is make a big Sinister Six and then copy a big Sinister Six. That's it. There are things that can get in your way. Like, for example, having one of the things that copies your Sinister Six, or really the answer is both of them, in your first 6 cards, which is really bad. You really don't want that to happen because then you can't copy a Sinister Six. But you spend the rest of the game then just playing good cards for tempo. Just like, oh, okay, well, if I can't copy a Sinister Six, what I'll do is I'll make a really big Venom and Arnim Zola that Venom. And I know that sounds like not a great game plan, but I gotta tell you, we are in a metagame where I am losing to things like Black Panther Zola. You can absolutely beat people by just doing like, here's a bunch of points. That's the world we're in right now. I don't think we've ever been in a metagame where this much stuff is totally okay to play. At least this year. I think 2 months ago, before we really got into the Mother Ascani, oh god, things are bad phase, I was like, this is as good as the metagame has been this whole year. And now, you know, knock on wood, I realized that the last time I said this, it precipitated Gambit Ascani, which is a nightmare. But, knock on wood, this is as good as the metagame has been this entire year. When Jay Walla posted this C3 deck, I knew I was going to be into it. One of the things that C3 has a big weakness to is that C3 is particularly bad at doing anything surprising. It is not easy to be surprising with a Cerebro 3 deck. Pretty much everybody knows what the hell you're doing and what your final turn is going to be. Oh wow, it's Mystique Cerebro. I wonder if I can beat that. That can damage your cube equity. What I like about this list is the utilization of Pixie and Mobius. Pixie on its own, mostly helpful. Most of your cards flipping between 2 and 3, it's kind of whatever. Mobius, on the other hand, just makes it an energy cheat engine. That's good. You are now able to have surprising final turns. You can do things with a Valkyrie that actually are able to win games and not just win one lane with that card. That's the worst thing about Valkyrie in C3, is that the card is so good and so bad at the same time because it's only ever winning one lane. So it's either going to be Valkyrie Nightcrawler or just Valkyrie, and that is horrible. But if you're able to actually get her discounted, you are going to win games that nobody is able to beat you in. That is a serious upgrade, is adding some actual confusion to the final turns of Cerebro 3 decks, because everyone who plays against this deck, at least at a high level, and I would be willing to bet at a lower level too, they know what the deal is. They know what's happening when you've only played 3 power cards the entire game and you're not gonna surprise them. Last up, the list that I've been playing a ton of recently. I've done a pretty quick 150 SP climb on this one, and I've particularly enjoyed playing it. It's been really solid, and I think it might, like, this is one of those things where, like, when Shadowlands Daredevil first came out, he was overshadowed by a couple of things, but the main thing he was being overshadowed by was the combination of original Gambit and original techno-organic virus. There were just better things to do in the space when you had the original TOV, because you really wanted to play that deck like a tech deck, and he makes your draws less consistent, so you're less consistently accessing TOV and you're less consistently accessing your tech. And that was bad. So every version of Shadowlands Daredevil TOV was a little bit worse than the non-Shadowlands Daredevil versions. But now we're in a different world, and Shadowlands Daredevil is no longer getting completely obliterated by the card Gambit Horseman of Death because they're making 50 copies of it, because that isn't happening nearly as much, and they aren't making as many copies of it when it does. That said, still certainly can happen. This is the list that I've been playing. Smiz actually hit rank 1 with it. He was playing a different card over Mirage. I enjoy the Mirage. I believe he had Red Guardian in there, but that's definitely a flex slot. You could also try like a Valentina or something to get Gambit to be more reliable, which brings me to how to play this list, because this list is very much built around tech and trying to interact with your opponent and being surprising with that. And I think a lot of people are going to see Gambit and they're going to be like, oh my god, it's a Gambit deck. That guy is not on a lot. He is a 3/5 that we are sometimes free rolling when we draw Iron Patriot. He is not your game plan. He is a 3/5. Your game plan is everything else here, basically. I think that there's a lot to be said for like solid output that just kind of occasionally can do cool stuff, but do not be afraid to get rid of the stats on things, or get rid of the abilities on something like Gambit. If it's not going to happen, get rid of the ability, get a TOV on it. The same goes for Spider-Man Brand New Day. It's great that he can move twice. Don't get married to him moving twice if it would cost you a TOV activation on him. That's a pretty important thing too. It's a strong, powerful list with a lot of solid interactive pieces that I think falls under the umbrella of like generally Wilson Fisk decks, and that's a good space to be in. This is a list that I've had a ton of success with. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.